Hello detectives. It's good to return to the world of online RPGs, a place that I have called home for over 20 years. But it's sad that my return marks the death of yet one more promising Kickstarter MMO title. I don't take any pleasure in the demise of any title, despite any Grim Reaper memes that exist, especially an MMO that was Kickstartered, as it can have negative effects on the market. And especially when it was helmed by a developer, J. Todd Coleman, who also led another ill-fallen MMO title with tons of personality and innovation, Shadowbane. Unfortunately, although Crowfall was led by industry vets like Coleman and even Gordon Walton, who helped ship Star Wars Galaxies and SWTOR, within less than 2 years, the game would be halted by Artcraft Entertainment, Crowfall's developer. With Crowfall's future uncertain and the game unshelved for the foreseeable future, it's found itself on this series, Death of a Game, where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death of a particular game or company and put it all together at the end for a final deduction consisting of the evidence gathered therein. Crowfall is a title I have followed quite closely, and I have a lot to say about it. But for now, let's get that nice transitional music going before we start our journey through the game's timeline detectives. Thank you to Netmarble and Soul-Eve for sponsoring this video. Paragon the Overprime is a collaborative effort of Netmarble, Epic Games, and developer Soul-Eve. They just recently had a closed beta test and have been steadily adding additional features to the game, as well as restoring old ones. Paragon the Overprime, much like the original title and more, is a free team-based third-person action MOBA game. Compared to most MOBAs, the graphics are hyper-realistic and impressive, and you have a number of dynamic heroes to choose from. Paragon the Overprime's team reached out to me to cover this project as it's set to launch sometime next year. Since I already covered Paragon before and thoroughly enjoyed the third-person MOBA take, it felt like a no-brainer. The game's early access will open on December 8th on Steam and the Epic Games Store. So if you're interested in learning more and playing as well, please go click the link in the description. Since the closed beta in April of 2022, the Soul-Eve team has had multiple balance patches, introduced a skill-based MMR, a tutorial, and a new competitive game mode, as well as providing preparation for events which would allow for larger group play at a later date. All of these changes sound quite important for Paragon, which has suffered from being a bit too off-putting for non-competitive players while also not being a completed game. These changes really help combat that. That means that Paragon the Overprime isn't just some rehashed title. It's an attempt at a fully released AAA launch version of the game, the one that never happened. Polish and new features and all. Paragon the Overprime is available now on Steam and Epic Games Store for free. Make sure to go test it out by going to the link that I have in the description. Thank you to Netmarble and Soul-Eve for sponsoring this video, and thank you to my channel for making this sponsorship possible. The story of Crowfall begins much before its Kickstarter, or at least the context before that point is rather relevant for the story and should be told. J. Todd Coleman, who would go on to found and direct Artcraft Entertainment, had originally cut his teeth on a player-focused hardcore MMORPG back in 2003. Shadowbane, we have already covered on the series, so go check that out, was a niche PvP MMO with one of the lowest budgets in major MMO history that was plagued with technical issues and an outdated client. But it certainly was innovative and impressive, and caught many people's attention as Coleman did it with very little resources. After his company was bought by Ubisoft, Coleman would go on to have serious design and production hands in the online RPG Wizard 101 and subsequent Pirate 101, which had a healthy level of success. Coleman sort of floated around to different projects and interests after that point, but met with another experienced developer who had also led and helped launch over 6 major MMORPGs, such as SWTOR, Star Wars Galaxies, and Ultima, Gordon Walton. Gordon and Coleman would talk about the desire to create a game that puts the focus back into the player's hands, something they and many others, including myself, felt that the virtual world space had started to lack. This meant a departure from the expensive and not sustainable structured dungeon and raid type story content that had been incredibly prevalent at the time. A risk, but not something impossible as other titles have had success in that respect. With their unnamed MMORPG, Gordon and Coleman were looking to create a PvP-based MMO that combined the ease of leveling in a game like Shadowbane that made it more accessible with the giant impressive siege PvP gameplay therein. The biggest unique twist being teased early on was persistent characters but dying and perishing worlds. Realms would have limited life cycles, with the winner crowned at the end. These worlds would be procedurally generated and allowed players to build and customize as well as conquer with destructible environments and massive siege battles. This would allow Walton and Coleman to accomplish putting the power back into the player's hands versus creating a short shelf life content, which has always been more expensive and harder to create. Trying to figure out how to fund such a project could be challenging even with a leaner offering of content. As with MMOs in general, let alone one trying to give more control to the players, something that doesn't permeate in the current market, at least at the moment. That's always the case until the market at least can prove otherwise. Big companies don't just follow one-offs or smaller trends unless they know that they can trust in it getting bigger. But a lot of big players have failed in the space, and so we haven't seen many of them in some time. Coleman and Walton would found an Austin, Texas-based game development company dubbed Artcraft Entertainment sometime in 2014. Artcraft would operate as a small studio focused on online RPGs with around 30 to 40 developers. Artcraft Entertainment would turn to a crowdfunding platform Kickstarter, which was making waves at the time for allowing players to fund games and projects of their choice for the funding for their upcoming MMORPG. The Kickstarter for the MMORPG, now being dubbed Crowfall, would launch February 25th, 2015, and within 3 days would exceed the funding asked for and then some. Crowfall, to further expound on what the game had to offer, was much like Todd had originally promised with Shadowbane, a throne war simulator. The idea was simple: create these campaign worlds that varied depending on the maps and the resources, which are randomly shifted and created, and the players choosing to play the map in a number of different ways. Different campaign worlds wouldn't just offer this variety, however, they would also allow for different rule sets that could increase the levels of risk, such as dropping whatever is in your inventory. Utilizing voxel technology, Crowfall would reportedly allow for destructible environments as well. So you could destroy a world, and then after your world dies, take that loot and your character progression back to the actual persistent world called the Eternal Kingdom. Sort of like a season of sorts, right? The difficulty in Crowfall would be more centered around the conflicts and the gameplay therein, and resources needed to achieve such, as leveling your character would be easy whether you choose to pick a preset character archetype or create a class yourself. Checking out Crunchbase, we can see that although Crowfall raised an impressive $1.7 million, which exceeded their funding by $966,000, on Kickstarter, they still felt like they were going to need more money to fund the project that they had in mind. These partial funding schemes seem to be quite common in the case of major game development, as the Kickstarter also doubles as an impressive and effective marketing tool. But relying on investment dollars meant that they weren't just a company for the people anymore. And I think that tells a bit of a different story than the one that was kind of painted personally. Because this meant that although players felt that they had a high level of control, right? Being in some ways the investors in the product, ultimately the funding that the players added to the overall funding of Crowfall was only 38% of the overall budget, which was helpful, but not enough in even a pure investment sense to have control. And that's a very important detail going forward. One of the largest fears of a Kickstarter is the project ever even being completed in the first place, especially since there's not much recourse for players who invest in the games. With an experienced team, however, Crowfall was distinguishing itself from the pack, reporting that they had reached their halfway point March 11th, 2015. Later that same year in September, Crowfall would have a playable pre-alpha deathmatch mode available for their backers. Crowfall, showing that they could prototype quickly, was building confidence, as many of their competitors also launched on Kickstarter were unable to do the same. This was very important for the game itself, as being called and sold as a throne war simulator meant that combat and warfare were going to be a very important part of the game and were going to need to be tested thoroughly. Things would get quieter for Crowfall during the next 2 years before they would show up again in a big way on May 16th, 2017, where they would reveal a major graphical overhaul. Significant progress had been made on the game at that point, with the core game mode being serviceable, and the next big thing on the docket being the Eternal Kingdom system. The Eternal Kingdom system was made to satisfy the persistent aspects of Crowfall, as the game was in some ways seeming more to be akin to a lobby game than a multiple world MMO. The gameplay shown on screen is what was teased at the time, and while animations and the actual flow of the combat seemed quite rough, the visuals were a noticeable improvement. Crowfall seemed to be going in the right direction, right? Going for this mixture of realism and stylization and doing a good job of it. This allowed them to play with a quite realistic looking architecture while still having the mythical and fantastical enemies and characters. For pre-alpha footage reportedly, this was good progress for sure. Crowfall, despite their progress, would delay their soft launch, which was sort of like an early access paid launch sort of thing, I'm not really sure. But it would be delayed until 2018, with reasons not explicitly stated other than just needing more time. This makes their comment about being halfway there 3 years prior seem a bit odd. But perhaps the scope had increased greatly since then. MMOs are incredibly difficult to develop, that must be acknowledged, the most difficult sort of game at that. But with the crowd having put their money into seeing the product launch, they were going to be extra scrutinizing when any mistake presented itself, and delays in lengthy alphas could also contribute to that. The world was shocked by the introduction of COVID. Many companies were hurt from the loss of having workers capable of working in the workplace. For the video game industry, largely besides the largest AAA gaming projects, typically full of bloat anyway, they weren't nearly as harmed as other industries were, as people had been working remotely in the industry for some time. So when Artcraft would take a PPP loan in April of 2020, loans that are given to failing companies during the time of COVID, and sure, they were a company that was hurt by COVID, but enough to take PPP funds? Arguably, if you are a few months before launching your game and you need to make more money, I don't think it's a good look. Or a just one. But this information, including Artcraft stopping their SEC reports before launch, are rather fishy. First off, the funding is not publicly accounted for. If a project is advertising itself as crowdfunded, you should know where the money is going and how much they have. Like reportedly, some of the other funding for Crowfall wasn't getting accounted for. I got information from 2 reliable sources that Crowfall not only put more money than 12 million, triple is the estimate, they also stated that Artcraft was using the funds that they gained from their Kickstarter to not just work on Crowfall, but another unknown project simply dubbed Project Atlas. The theory from my source is that the SEC report stopped because the funding was being used to fund another project altogether, and they didn't want that to be shown. I actually had to go back and edit my script to add this part, and even do the voiceover, which is probably why it sounds different. Also, I just woke up. That's how breaking news is, after all. I got a YouTube comment and an email in the same day. We don't have confirmation of this theory, right? Naturally, but the additional information in official records do both complicate and murky things even more. For starters, the dollar amount raised by Crowfall was, according to my source, much higher. And why would they hide that and not make it public? Why not make public the additional funding? Well, they didn't want people to know. So either that was because of how they got the funding, or maybe they were indeed funneling it elsewhere. By the fall of 2020, Crowfall had reached its beta status. This signified that they were very close to launching. My issue in game development is when developers and companies will blame their budget for why they can't market their game properly. And this unfortunately plagued Crowfall, and you could see it in the promotional content that was released with the update, like the trailer on screen. Whoever made these trailers either had $3 and a piece of lint as a budget, aka not a computer, or is just sorely out of touch with what MMO players want or respond well to. All of the gameplay footage shown is stationary targets, which you don't see happen nearly ever in a siege-based faction warfare type game, right? Because people will get hit. You stand in the lava, that type of thing, right? Oh yeah. Crowfall was faction-based now. Originally, the game had been kind of sold more as this individual guild and clan-based game, which is like Shadowbane, the game that it was inspired by, but the game now was a full faction-based game. And the gameplay footage looked like people PvPing back in 2001, and the music and overall narrative of the video is just plain campy. Chosen by the gods. Like, what? That seems just randomly interjected like it's supposed to be significant. But we don't know who the gods are and why they're even important besides just being the gods. The video both is bad at showcasing what's new in the beta version of the game, which should be something you should do, right? Which should be important for attracting both new and returning players. It's also bad at showing the excitement possible in the game period, right? Because most footage shown looks like it's intentionally shown as to not lag, and I should know, because I used to play Warhammer Online with 15 FPS and that was looking at the ground. So I know all the tricks. If it sounds like I'm picking on this promotional video too hard, it's, well, good. Okay, that's not my intention. The intention is to actually showcase the majority of the videos showcased on the YouTube channel and how they feel out of touch with the market and what feels exciting and what's wanted. Feel free to go watch them for yourself and tell me if they rival even 20-year-old trailers like Dark Age of Camelot, Ultima Online, or even more recent ones like Warhammer Online, of course, the extreme CGI examples like SWTOR. They have to be capable of beating somebody though, right? Whether this is because Artcraft chose the wrong people to lead their marketing and videography, or they just simply didn't take it seriously enough, the result was going to be a lack of interest, and thus players for Crowfall though. Possibly as an answer to the lack of interest in player base, Artcraft would attempt to follow trends. A few years too late, I might add, but still. With the addition of a new world dubbed Hunger Dome. Hunger Dome, as the name implies, was a battle royale, but for the Crowfall universe. Some players were happy about the addition of the world, while others realized the intention behind it all. On the eve of a launch, Crowfall was struggling to have enough population to test properly, and how long the game was available for testing was probably the bigger culprit there. The game before its beta phase had already been playable for 2 years and some change, and while that can be an effective way to get feedback without direction in more limited sessions, players can just get burnt out on the game before it even releases. This is something that has happened to tons of players in Hi-Rez's Global Agenda, such as myself, another Death of a Game that we covered, where they had a paid beta test, but people like myself played the game religiously until finding out that the game just had no endgame to speak of, and bounced before launch. If Crowfall was going to keep the overhauls coming in and new content flooding in, perhaps they could re-attract those former backers, but if they couldn't bring them in, then what were the chances of them bringing in new players? Crowfall would officially launch July 6, 2021, 6 years after the game's Kickstarter launch. Unfortunately, those high expectations from backers and new players alike wouldn't be met, for a number of reasons, as Crowfall would fail to wow critics and players alike. Classic preface though, that anytime we talk about reviews, critics, and MMOs in the same conversation, critics historically haven't rated MMOs in the most effective or helpful ways. So they're not always the law of the land or even the most helpful, but when many critics are crying foul, well then you have something to look at. Critics are just easier to track than player perception as well, which is why we still rely on them in the series even when covering MMOs. IGN would rate Crowfall a very poor 5 out of 10, and while the writer clearly didn't seem to know what he was getting himself into whenever he picked the project up as an assignment or was assigned it in the first place, there's some valid points raised about the lackluster performance in the game and the clunky UI in combat. MMORPG.com, as the name implies on the other hand, was a bit more familiar with the style of game being presented, and yet all the same rated them the same painful 5 out of 10. While they enjoyed the variety of characters to choose from and the stylized graphical design present in the game, they expressed distaste due to the described as rough combat and how empty the world felt. That emptiness, to go back to my previous point, is seen in the trailers as well. It's a difficult balance with MMOs where players want giant open zones to fulfill the massive part of the acronym. But developers don't often want to dedicate the resources to making giant zones feel incredibly detailed, as that can be incredibly time-consuming when you're making multiple zones. In Crowfall's case, the worlds themselves were randomized terrain. That meant that by nature, the randomization along with the game's strong lack of proper lore makes the world both feel empty and just pointless. Sure, as PC Gamer, who rated Crowfall 64 out of 100, stated, there were some deep systems in Crowfall, but it seemed like the game was falling flat on its face because the whole core of the game, the PvP and the combat, was boring and clunky, and the world, which is important to house all of those battles and make them matter, wasn't any more compelling. The critics had spoken, and the crowd wasn't much kinder. Crowfall had failed to deliver on expectations, and didn't seem to have enough players to keep hopes around that they would at some point. When your core game is what is setting people off, it's not like adding more content or a few skins is going to change the game's faulty core. Usually you see a few big pushes from a developer when their game is faltering in an attempt to keep the game going or try to address the criticism and improve, but Artcraft either felt like they had little to no chance, or there was just some serious negligence in game management and community management. I think devs might overlook it, but in this modern age you just can't, not with all the content being consumed on it. Crowfall's YouTube would be abandoned in September of 2021, which wasn't a good look, especially when they could have used this opportunity to try to talk to their audience and be transparent. Instead, it felt like Crowfall was taking their ball and going home. Thanks to the work of another virtual world YouTuber, apparently also part-time detective, Kira TV, and more supporting detectives, the investor report concerning Crowfall was leaked December 6, 2021. And what was disclosed in it was crucial for the future of Crowfall. According to Kira TV, who cited a leaked investor report, The MMO is on the ropes and could be shutting down in a couple of months. The report allegedly sent out to players who had equity crowdfunding investor shares in the game said that Crowfall had been performing below expectations and has an inability to acquire customers at a positive ROI. This both meant an inability to acquire whales, which are players who spend a lot of money enough to account for many players, and customers, well, period. The team at Artcraft had been reduced, according to the report as well. Todd Coleman, the founder at Artcraft and main leading force of Crowfall, had also moved on to another Artcraft project, Project Atlas, once Crowfall was released, which meant that he hadn't had his veteran experience able to help them on Crowfall since then. But it could mean something far worse, such as Todd knew what was coming and wanted to pivot as fast as possible. After all, Artcraft is his company, and he doesn't want to shut it down versus shutting a game down. The part about having to pivot off of Crowfall, at the very least of the report that was leaked, seems kind of true, and Artcraft was working on another project. This wasn't good news for Crowfall, as it surely meant it would be shelved in the coming future if the report proved to be correct. Something was amiss, because news would hit the web December 11, 2021 that the company behind Crowfall, Artcraft Entertainment, would be acquired by Mythgard card game developer Monument. Not very much details are listed in the actual press release, but more details would be released when simultaneously news hit the web that J. Todd Coleman would be officially stepping back from Crowfall to focus on Project Atlas, which seemed to confirm the rumors, right? In the same release, Coleman stated that Gordon Walton and Crowfall's dev team would be joining Monument to continue to assist on Crowfall's development, but that Artcraft with Coleman and the other remaining devs would continue to work on Project Atlas. Clearly this, as Coleman explains, was also a business decision of not being able to invest too much resources from reportedly a resource-starved company to make Crowfall work, and having to essentially put their future somewhere else. Monty Kerr, CEO of Monumental, had a previous relationship consisting of being critical of Todd and his work, but Todd had a friendship with Monty that made him aware of him. According to Todd, Monty approached Todd with a plan to revitalize the game, and Todd decided it was actually best to just sell the game off to Monty and allow him and his appointed team to run the game. Todd literally says in the press release that he was tired of trying to make virtual worlds work and wanted someone else to take the banner, and that Crowfall's issues included big competitors, lack of advertising funds, lots of market fatigue, and of course too much work to fix or improve the game and not enough people to do it. Todd also adds a little blurb at the end that kind of implies that he knows people would disagree with him, which isn't really a good look, because not only does Todd not address the failure of Crowfall and what could have been done better, he seems to pass off the failures as kind of out of his control. Let's start with the reasons though. Big competitors shouldn't affect Crowfall that much, according to the lead dev who worked on the game, Gordon Walton. After all, remember, the game is going after a different audience. So why does a big competitor really affect Crowfall if there's not really even any of them in the market? It's not like they had any direct competitors unless you want to count the fact that they crossed their game themselves into the survival game genre territory and were outperformed there too. Lack of advertising funds is a serious issue, but not one I can say contributed to Crowfall's failure. I think it's a bit of a scapegoat that most players and developers use for poorly designed or marketed games. There's a difference between marketing poorly and not having enough money to market, period. In the former, that means that you're spending money and just doing it inefficiently, a double whammy of a failure. And as we pointed out previously with the trailers and promotional content for Crowfall, it consisted of a guy they hired off of Fiverr to do a voiceover and a bunch of character models standing still while banging on each other. That's more of an issue of not knowing what the player base that you're trying to attract wants and how to market to them effectively. As for the market fatigue question, again, literally, what are they being fatigued from? This is a horrible argument, or at least a throwaway argument that I'm going to take seriously. Market fatigue shouldn't be why a unique hybrid niche throne war simulator fails. They're literally unique in the market, right? That's the whole point. They almost have nothing directly like them. The issue is that Crowfall being a hybrid MMO and survival style game, including the server structure and everything, meant that it was going to be compared to other games in those genres as well. For example, the building would be compared to Minecraft, Rust, and the like, while the MMO parts would be compared to previous greats and the closest similar titles in existence. To put bluntly, Crowfall wasn't an issue of being squished out, as Todd has stated. It was an issue of the game based on a previous style and generation of a game that failed to do as much, innovatively speaking, as that one did, and failed to ultimately compete even in the modern market. But I truly believe that Crowfall's biggest issues are design related, and I will cover that in detail before we get to our final deduction, so don't worry. I needed to finish up the timeline first though, and the last entry on the timeline is November 7th, 2022, and it reads solemnly, Crowfall goes dark. 1 year after the reports of Crowfall possibly being shuttered, and Mythgard and Artcraft felt they were unable to implement the changes properly while also maintaining live service of the game. Which I should add is essentially one of the most difficult parts of running an MMO period, but it is a core part of an MMO. So I find their reasoning to be quite worrying, because I can't deny that it would make the game easier to change if they brought it down first, but again, that's kind of what it means to develop an MMO. We've seen some games go through massive transformations like this, Rift, Final Fantasy XIV, and a few others, but I'm not very optimistic for Crowfall's chances going forward. Not unless they can really go back to the drawing board on some things I will cover very shortly. But they were claiming they weren't giving up and were willing to essentially try anything. The servers would be brought down officially November 22nd, 2022. So I kept mentioning my desire to go further into detail about the design of Crowfall, and it's much easier to leave it to the end of the video than make the timeline too convoluted in the middle of it. So let's start with what Crowfall is. It's a Throne War simulator game where players can customize their own worlds with rule sets, and then participate in giant 3-faction PvP battles to be crowned the victor at the end. Each world and rule set theoretically offers different gameplay experiences. The issue I have with this from the jump is that combining a temporary genre, the survival genre, known for having short life cycles on maps that get wiped, and the MMO genre, one known for longevity and long-term progression, is problematic for a number of reasons. For starters, it communicates a bit of a mixed message. Players can't get nearly as invested into their characters because essentially they will give them up every campaign. And yes, some might say, but what about the Eternal Kingdoms? But why would you think that further segmenting your world, which already lacks purpose and lore, would actually be a good thing to make players feel more fulfilled? It's just basically another instance place for players to go to, and it's not competitive with WildStar or Star Wars Galaxy's housing. The other issue is because there's very little lore and points of interest that bring purpose to the world, it makes the fighting basically just fighting for the sake of it. People aren't really engrossed in the story and don't particularly care about the world. So now you have a game that's this Throne War simulator without all of the social intrigue that games like Eve and Darkfall and RuneScape are known for. Which brings me into a point I have sort of already covered, which is combat. Before I cover the combat itself, you have to do me a favor and try watching a PvP battle in Crowfall and tell me if you know or have any idea what's going on. In fact, try watching this. I don't even know why it exists, but it's an esport battleground competition in Crowfall. The commentators during the battle most of the time talk about strategy, and not tactics, and tactics is what happens in the middle of the battle. It's the minutia that players need to be explained, because if you're not a high-level player, you can usually miss things. But not even these commentators can accurately describe what's happening in these battles. These particle effects have been turned up 300% on a dial to the point to where even a simple slow seems to take up half the screen, with visual noise or some kind of animation. This makes the combat hard to track, but worse, because of these issues alongside the animation issues, such as animations not giving players enough information to make counter plays against. For example, as a former Guild Wars 2 pro, one of these would be an example of like timing somebody's heal, or interrupting a spell. So it's difficult to actually make tactical adjustments because all of the visual noise on the screen is distracting you, alongside the fact that animations and status effects are unclear. And I've demonstrated this on my stream before, where even a player of MMOs like myself for 20 plus years can't tell when someone's stunned, dazed, or so on and so forth sometimes. The game has, no joke, 30 plus status effects. I mean, when you're suppressed in the game, it literally just says suppressed in large letters. There's no clear visual identifier. I mean shit, Tom right now is scrolling through all of the status effects, and before people scream skill gap or knowledge gap, I haven't even finished talking about the combat. Not only is it confusing to know what's going on in Crowfall, throw in the fact that character animations as mentioned are problematic and it's made even worse. The legs on the character you play run in different directions sometimes and cross over each other all the time, which is a cardinal sin in basically all forms of combat. And I've been doing martial arts just as long as I've kind of no-lifed these games. But the final knock on Crowfall's combat is how it actually handles, and that's arguably the most important part because you can't reliably fix that, not with a few patches or updates. Crowfall just feels clunky. and that's the most damning part of it. If the game felt smooth and had combat that was more akin to Guild Wars 2 or Darkfall, or games that are known for having good gameplay, then there would be way more to salvage. Crowfall for me though feels clunkier than Warhammer Online, and that was a game notorious for being clunky because it used a very old engine, Gamebryo. The main difference is that Warhammer was a flawed but solid game with plenty of systems that worked and people enjoyed, and their combat functioned quite well despite the clunkiness, with clear visual clarity and good combat tempo and status effect usage. So when yet again your entire game is based on combat and you aren't that good at it, it's kind of hard to have any other expectation than what happened. There's some people that would point to Unity as being the culprit too, which is not traditionally used as a game development engine for massive online RPGs. But you can't blame a lack of understanding of how to build compelling combat in an online game on an engine alone, when it has plenty of games to the contrary. If you're hearing that music, it means we have reached the end of the video. Well, sort of. It's the best part of the video, not just because of the catchy tune, but because it's the final deduction time. Time to take our gathered clues and evidence and put this crow to bed. Very poor marketing and community development. Misleading as it's not a true crowd-funded game. Poor visual clarity in fights. Overexposed at the wrong times. Lack of lore and a general purpose. Lackluster combat in a combat war simulator. Demonstrates the lack of learning from mistakes and the market. Game exists in this hybrid status and fails both market competitions. Crowfall was one of the best Kickstarter projects we had seen presented during the wave of them, and with its veteran leadership was seemingly destined to be a force in the MMO world. Instead, it couldn't even last half a year without talks of shuttering the project. A throne war simulator as a sales pitch is a strong one. But without the proper game and world to support that idea in the end, it felt more like a curse of expectation than a good thing. The sad part is this is like the game creator himself even said, the same thing that happened in Shadowbane. And if you're having the same problems 10 years later, it not only implies you haven't learned from your competition, it means you didn't learn from your own mistakes. And to throw Coleman and the talented team who worked on the game some bail, they had an incredibly ambitious project with a very small budget, and did very good despite their failures. But then, just maybe stop making such ambitious projects. Maybe just focus on something that works first, period, in both the literal sense and the figurative sense. Something more contained and measured that shows off your strengths. As for you detectives, thanks for watching.
We awoke from one nightmare into another.